The hospital had been abandoned for decades, yet its shadow still clung to the streets like a heavy fog. Locals whispered about its halls, how at night the air felt thick, almost suffocating, and how faint cries would echo through the crumbling corridors. You could drive past it during the day, and it looked harmless enough. Broken windows patched with plywood, graffiti on the walls, weeds overtaking the parking lot. But at night, people said the hospital came alive. Not with people, not with normal noises, but with something darker, something that didn't belong in this world. Our first story begins with Emily, a nursing student who had always been fascinated by abandoned places. She had heard about the old St. Agatha's Hospital from her classmates, how patients had vanished under mysterious circumstances, how the night staff had reported seeing shadowy figures that moved against the light. Emily didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in evidence, in science, in what could be recorded and proven. But curiosity, as it always does, got the better of her. It was a Friday evening when Emily and two of her friends decided to explore the hospital. Armed with flashlights, a handheld camera, and a voice recorder, they slipped through a gap in the chain link fence. The air smelled of decay, damp plaster, and something faintly metallic. The main doors were locked, so they squeezed through a side entrance, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The inside was worse than Emily had imagined. Peeling paint, rusted beds, and medical charts scattered across the floor made it look like the patients had disappeared mid-treatment. Every step echoed unnaturally in the empty halls. Emily set up the voice recorder in what had once been the maternity ward, just for fun, hoping to catch any EVP, electronic voice phenomenon. Hours passed and nothing happened. The group laughed at their own paranoia, convinced the stories were exaggerated. But then, in the corner of her eye, Emily saw it. A figure, pale and blurred, standing at the end of the hallway. She froze, thinking it was a trick of the light. But the figure didn't move like a human. It glided, its head tilted unnaturally. And even from across the hall, Emily could feel the intense cold radiating from it. She blinked, and it was gone. Her friends didn't see it. They joked, saying her eyes were playing tricks. But Emily knew what she had seen. They continued exploring, moving toward the second floor. The stairs creaked under their weight, and every sound was amplified, bouncing off the walls like whispers. They reached the surgical wing, where gurneys still sat in rows. rust eating into the metal frames. Suddenly, the air dropped in temperature, their breath visible in the flashlight beams. Then came the screams, not from them, not at first. From somewhere deep in the wing, a wail echoed, bone-chilling and guttural, as if a person were being dragged across the floor, screaming in agony. Emily's hand shook as she turned the camera toward the sound. There was nothing at first, just the empty hallway. Then, in the reflection of a shattered window, she saw dozens of faces pressed against the glass, pale, contorted, their mouths opening in silent screams. Panic set in. They ran, but the building seemed to stretch endlessly, corridors twisting in ways that defied logic. They reached the stairs, only to find them collapsed, leading nowhere. Emily's friend, Mark, whispered that they should have never come here. But Emily, her rational mind clashing with terror, kept moving, pushing forward, following a faint whisper calling her name. The whisper led her to what used to be the psychiatric ward. Doors lined the walls, some slightly ajar. As Emily approached one, the door slammed shut on its own, knocking her flashlight out of her hand. In the darkness, she could hear scratching, long, deliberate, moving across the walls. Something breathed heavily behind the door, and then a voice, soft but unmistakable. "Why are you here?" Emily and her friends bolted, finally finding a side exit that led back to the parking lot. They didn't speak as they ran, only gasping for air, hearts pounding. Emily later reviewed the footage they captured. In one clip, the hallway seemed normal, but then shadows moved against the light, walls bending slightly, and faint figures appearing for just a frame before vanishing. She never went back. Even the thought of the hospital made her skin crawl. Later, she learned that St. Agatha's had been the site of several mysterious deaths, with bodies disappearing without explanation. Medical experiments rumored to have been conducted in secret, and patients reporting voices calling them from dark corners before vanishing. Emily never believed in ghosts, but she could not explain what she saw. And sometimes, late at night, she could still hear a whisper, soft and insistent, "Why are you here?" Not all haunted experiences happen in abandoned places, though. Our second story is of a nurse named Laura, who worked the night shift at a functioning hospital in the city. Unlike Emily, Laura wasn't looking for ghosts. She was just trying to finish her shift. But the hospital, she would later say, had its own appetite for fear. Laura's story begins with a new ICU wing. patients had been transferred there after a renovation, but staff reported strange occurrences almost immediately. Monitors would turn on and off by themselves. Doors would lock without reason, and some patients claimed to see shadows hovering over their beds. Laura, skeptical, dismissed it as exhaustion. That was until one particularly stormy night, when a patient in room 312 started screaming violently. She rushed to the room, expecting delirium or pain. But the patient was pointing toward the ceiling, eyes wide, lips moving as if forming words Laura couldn't hear. Then the lights flickered, and a dark figure appeared above the patient, hanging in the corner of the room. Laura froze, unable to move. The figure was humanoid, yet distorted, like it was a shadow twisted into human form. It didn't attack, didn't speak. It simply watched. Laura tried to call for help, but her phone wouldn't work, and the nurse's radio crackled with static. The voice distorted, almost screaming. When the lights returned, the figure was gone, and the patient was calm again, as if nothing had happened. Laura knew what she had seen couldn't be rationalized. The hospital had shown her something not meant for living eyes. And then there was the third story of a security guard named Tom. He patrolled the late-night corridors of an old wing scheduled for demolition. Tom was a skeptic. He had worked in security for years and never believed in the paranormal. But that night, he saw the impossible. As he walked down a hallway, he noticed a door slowly creaking open at the far end. Inside, he could see the faint outline of a person, sitting perfectly still, staring straight at him. Tom called out, asking if the person needed help. No response. He approached cautiously, but as he drew near, the figure disappeared, not by moving, but by fading, as if evaporating into the air. The door slammed behind him, even though he hadn't touched it. He ran out, shaken, and swore never to enter that wing again. Later, he learned that the wing had been used as an isolation ward decades earlier, where patients had died under mysterious circumstances, often alone. Haunted hospitals don't always follow rules of reality. Some are subtle, their horror psychological. Some are sudden, violent, and impossible to explain. Emily, Laura, and Tom were ordinary people, caught in ordinary lives, suddenly facing the extraordinary. Their stories share one thing: hospitals are not just buildings for healing. They are spaces where fear, tragedy, and the unknown linger like a stubborn shadow. By now, you may be wondering, How much of this is real and how much is your mind filling in the gaps? That's the beauty and terror of haunted hospitals. They force you to confront your disbelief. They make you question the safety of places that are supposed to be sanctuaries. And in that questioning, they capture you, holding you in a space where reality bends and anything seems possible. It was his third week on the night shift when he noticed it. The faint smell of antiseptic mixed with something rotten. A scent that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. The corridors were silent, except for the occasional beep of a heart monitor in the distance. At first, Michael chalked it up to exhaustion. But then, he began hearing things. Soft footsteps behind him. Doors opening and closing when no one was there. Whispers that seemed to echo his own thoughts. The first incident occurred in the old pediatric wing. Michael was checking charts when he noticed a small figure at the end of the hall. It was a child, wearing a hospital gown far too large for its tiny frame. The child's face was obscured by shadows, but Michael felt an intense pressure in the room, as if the air itself were pressing down on him. "Are you okay?" he called out. The child didn't answer. Instead, it lifted a small hand and pointed toward room 214. Michael's curiosity, combined with his training, pushed him forward. Inside the room, he found it empty, but not empty in the normal sense. The bed was neatly made, toys lined up on the windowsill, and the walls had faint, childish scribbles etched into the paint. But what really caught his attention were the words scratched into the wall near the bed. "Don't look behind you." Michael's heart raced. He tried to laugh it off, blaming stress and long hours. But the air felt thick, suffocating. When he turned to leave, he saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the room, not reflected in any mirror, not attached to any surface. The shadow moved faster than any human could, slipping along the walls, stretching toward him like a living liquid. Michael ran, exiting the pediatric wing and slamming the door behind him. The corridor was empty again, silent except for the distant hum of the ventilation system. But when he reviewed the security footage later, the hallway had been normal. No shadow, no child, no warning etched on the wall. Only he had experienced it. Across town, another nurse, Claire, had her own terrifying encounter. She worked in a rehabilitation hospital that had once been a tuberculosis sanatorium in the early 1900s. The patients were mostly elderly, some confused, some bedridden, but all had a strange fear of a particular hallway on the third floor. Claire initially dismissed their claims until she saw it herself. One night, Claire was administering medication when she heard singing. Soft, faint, almost lullaby-like, coming from the end of the hallway. She thought it was one of the patients humming, but as she approached, the sound grew louder, yet no one was there. The temperature dropped sharply, and her breath condensed in the air. She could see faint fog curling along the floor, but it wasn't cold enough to cause condensation. At the end of the hallway, a figure emerged, translucent and shimmering like light through water. It was Cease. It was a woman, dressed in a nurse's uniform from decades past, moving gracefully but unnaturally. Her eyes were empty sockets, yet Claire felt herself being watched, judged, drawn into her presence. The figure spoke. No words, just a sound like the tearing of paper, followed by a cold whisper. "Leave while you can." Claire bolted, heart pounding, never returning to that hallway at night. Meanwhile, in another part of the country, a group of medical students dared each other to explore the abandoned psychiatric ward of a long-forgotten hospital. Among them was Jordan, whose curiosity bordered on obsession. They entered through a cracked window, flashlights cutting through the dense blackness. The moment they stepped inside, the air seemed to change, thick and oppressive, carrying with it the unmistakable smell of decay. The students split up, each taking a hallway. Jordan wandered into what had once been the electroshock therapy room. Old equipment sat rusting in the corners, straps still dangling from the tables. As he inspected the room, he noticed a faint tapping sound behind him. He turned. Nothing. But then the tapping continued, moving closer, faster, circling him in a pattern that defied explanation. Panic surged through him. He called out to his friends, but their voices didn't carry. Then came the whispers. At first, incoherent, overlapping voices, chanting or perhaps laughing. Jordan tried to leave, but the door slammed shut, trapping him. His flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness between flickers, he saw them. Dozens of faces pressed against the walls, mouths moving in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. The whispers grew louder, faster, almost intelligible. "We are still here. We never left." Finally, a force, something unseen, pushed him to the ground. Jordan crawled toward the door, threw it open, and stumbled into the main hallway where his friends waited, pale and shaken. They didn't speak, only ran, driven by a terror they couldn't name. Later, they found out that the building had a history of mysterious deaths. patients vanishing during the night, staff quitting abruptly after reporting hauntings. Jordan never went back. Not all hauntings require full-bodied apparitions. Some are subtle, psychological, lingering like a shadow in your mind. Lisa, a night nurse, experienced one such haunting in a children's oncology ward. A young boy named Ethan had been battling leukemia for months. One night, Lisa entered his room to find the bed empty, blankets neatly folded, toys arranged in a perfect circle. Ethan had been asleep when she last checked, but now, nothing. Lisa called out his name. The room grew cold. The toys began to move slowly, rotating clockwise in a perfect, unnatural rhythm. A lullaby began to play, faint, as if coming from the walls themselves. Lisa froze as a voice whispered, "It's time to go." She saw a shadowy hand reach from the corner of the room, faint but unmistakable. Panic took over, and she ran, leaving the door open. By morning, Ethan was back in bed, asleep, with no signs of disturbance, just a faint chill in the air. Then there is the story of a night janitor named Frank, who worked at a hospital notorious for deaths under suspicious circumstances. Frank had been cleaning the surgical wing for years, seen everything from gruesome accidents to medical emergencies. But one night, he encountered something he couldn't explain. He was mopping the floor when the lights flickered. He paused, sensing a presence behind him. Turning, he saw a man in a patient gown, standing perfectly still, staring at him. Frank called out, but the figure didn't respond. As Frank approached, the figure's face twisted into an expression of unimaginable pain, mouth opening wide, emitting a silent scream. Frank stumbled back, tripping over a bucket, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. But on the floor where the figure had stood were faint footprints, wet as if from water, yet the floor was dry. Haunted hospitals are filled with these kinds of contradictions. Sounds that can't be explained, figures that vanish instantly, sensations of being watched, followed, or called. Some of these stories remain undocumented, told only in whispered conversations among staff, students, and visitors. Others, like Emily's, Michael's, Claire's, and Jordan's, leave a mark, both on the person and on the legend of the hospital itself. What's striking about these haunted hospitals is the contrast between their purpose and the terror they house. A hospital is meant to heal, to comfort, to restore life. Yet in these abandoned wings, deserted rooms, and forgotten wards, the opposite occurs. Fear, sorrow, and death seem to linger, feeding off the residual energy left behind. Patients, staff, and trespassers all sense it differently, but the result is the same: an undeniable presence that defies logic, one that doesn't adhere to the rules of reality. As night falls in these hospitals, the difference between the living and the dead blurs. The corridors stretch endlessly. Shadows lengthen unnaturally. Whispers fill the silence, beckoning, warning, dumbing. And for those brave or foolish enough to enter, the hospital tests the limits of fear, showing that some places never forget the pain they witnessed, and some presences never leave. David's first night in the hospital felt almost normal, too normal. The dim overhead lights flickered occasionally, a minor annoyance in an otherwise quiet building. He was checking on the storage rooms when he heard a faint metallic scraping sound. At first, he assumed it was an old cart rolling across the tiles. But the sound grew louder, closer, coming from multiple directions at once. David's heart started racing. He turned a corner and saw it. A gurney moving slowly down the hallway. By itself. No one was pushing it. The wheels squeaked in a rhythm that was unnervingly human. David froze, debating whether to investigate or run. Curiosity won. As he approached, the gurney suddenly stopped, and from beneath the white sheet came a faint whisper. "Help me!" David recoiled. When he looked again, the sheet had fallen to the floor, empty. But the imprint of a body remained perfectly formed. Meanwhile, in another part of the country, a nurse named Rachel had her own horrifying experience. She worked in the ICU of a hospital built over the ruins of an older asylum. The staff rarely spoke about the basement, a place used for storage and staff meetings. But many claimed it was haunted. Rachel didn't believe in ghosts, not until she was forced to spend a night there during renovations. Around midnight, she heard soft scratching coming from the locked supply closets. At first, she thought it was rats. But then, the scratching turned into knocks. Deliberate, pace, almost like a message. Rachel approached cautiously. The doors were locked, yet the knocking continued, now accompanied by a cold breeze that seemed to wrap around her. The air smelled like old paper, rust, and something she couldn't identify. Something organic. Summoning her courage, Rachel tried to open one closet. The handle turned, but the door wouldn't budge. Then, A voice whispered directly into her ear, "You shouldn't be here." She spun around. No one was there. The room was empty, except for shadows cast by her flickering flashlight. The knocking began again, louder this time, and the whisper followed, "Leave before it sees you." Rachel bolted upstairs, leaving her equipment behind, heart pounding. In another hospital far away, security guard Tom experienced something even stranger. Tom worked the night shift and was familiar with every corner of the hospital. Or so he thought. One night, as he patrolled the oncology ward, he noticed the lights flicker in a rhythmic pattern. Tom had seen faulty wiring before, but this was different. The flicker seemed intentional, almost like Morse code. He followed the pattern, tapping on the walls in a mirror rhythm. Suddenly, the overhead lights went out completely, leaving him in darkness. A low moan began to echo through the ward, growing louder and forming words. "Don't leave. Stay." Tom shone his flashlight down the hallway and saw hundreds of shadowy figures lining the walls, their faces twisted in pain, their eyes hollow. He ran, slipping and scraping his hands on the floor tiles, reaching the security office only when the first light of dawn broke. Not all encounters involved shadowy figures or whispering voices. Sometimes it was the inexplicable movement of objects that terrified staff and visitors alike. In one hospital, a night nurse named Hannah noticed that the medication carts would rearrange themselves overnight. Syringes, pills, and bandages shifted positions, forming strange, almost ritualistic patterns. She would place them carefully before leaving for the night, only to find them altered in ways that defied gravity and logic. One particularly disturbing night, Hannah stayed late to observe the carts. Around 2:13 a.m., she heard the faintest click, a sound like a lid closing. Turning, she saw all the drawers of the carts opening simultaneously, then slamming shut with a synchronized force. In the middle of the floor appeared a message, scratched into the tiles. "You should not be here." Hannah left immediately, reporting the incident to her supervisor, who dismissed it as a prank. Yet she knew no one could have done this alone, especially not silently. Some hauntings were more personal. In a rural hospital, a nurse named Sam was assigned to a terminally ill patient who had been admitted multiple times over the years. During his final night, Sam was alone in the room, monitoring vital signs. Around midnight, the patient sat up in bed, eyes wide, and whispered, "I see them too." Sam glanced around the empty room. "See what?" he asked. The patient pointed toward the corner, where a shadow seemed to pulsate. Suddenly, the shadow stretched and took a semi-human form, moving silently across the room. Sam froze as the patient's eyes widened further. "They don't like visitors," the patient said, voice trembling. Moments later, the shadow disappeared, leaving a cold emptiness. The patient passed away quietly a few hours later. Sam never returned to that room alone. Then there was the story of a medical student named Rachel, not related to the previous nurse, who spent late nights in the hospital library researching rare diseases. The library was quiet, isolated, with tall shelves casting deep shadows. One night, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. Spinning around, she found no one there. A whisper came from between the shelves. "Knowledge comes at a price." Books began to fall around her, pages flipping wildly as though caught in a windstorm, though the air was still. The next morning, Rachel found that the books had all fallen in perfect rows, as if nothing had happened. Yet, when she checked the digital logs, she saw that multiple entries had been typed into her research notes. Notes she had no memory of writing. She left the library immediately and never returned after dark. Some hospitals had reputations that seemed to attract hauntings. In an old psychiatric hospital, closed for decades, paranormal investigators reported hearing patients' cries echoing down long hallways. Their cries were not merely loud. They conveyed fear, anger, and sorrow, layered upon each other like overlapping records. One investigator, entering the abandoned wing, felt a cold hand grasp his ankle. Looking down, he saw nothing. Moments later, a patient's voice screamed in his ear, "You're not supposed to be here." Similarly, in a children's ward of another hospital, night staff reported toys moving on their own, music boxes playing faintly, and a little girl in a gown appearing in doorways. She never spoke, only stared, with eyes too old for her youthful face. Those who interacted with her reported intense nausea, anxiety, and an overwhelming sadness they couldn't shake for days. Many staff refused to work nights, citing the little girl as the reason. Even in hospitals still in active use, these hauntings persisted. Equipment would malfunction inexplicably. Alarms would trigger for no reason, and faint voices would echo down hallways when no one was there. It was as if the hospitals themselves remembered every scream, every sorrow, and every death, replaying the residual energy to anyone unfortunate enough to witness it. The common thread among these stories is the violation of expectation. Hospitals are places of healing, of hope. Yet, these hauntings turn the expectation on its head. shadows where light should be, whispers where silence should prevail, movement where nothing should move. The living are confronted with the remnants of suffering, grief, and unfinished business. And for those who encounter it, the experience leaves a mark, not just on their psyche, but on their sense of reality itself. As the night stretches on, the corridors of these hospitals seem endless. Rooms twist and turn impossibly. Doors open into walls, and shadows stretch toward the living, beckoning them deeper. It is a place where fear feeds upon itself, where every sound, every flicker, and every cold draft carries a message. You're not alone. At first, everything seemed normal. Peeling paint, broken tiles, and the faint smell of mildew. But as they reached the old ICU, the atmosphere shifted. The air became cold, almost suffocating, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights, long since removed, seemed to vibrate in their ears. Mark noticed a gurney in the corner, rusted and still, but shadows flickered around it unnaturally. Suddenly, the group heard a high-pitched, guttural moan. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. One of the explorers laughed nervously, dismissing it as an animal trapped inside. But the sound grew louder, more articulate, forming the words, "Get out." The letters were spoken in a low, grinding tone, almost mechanical, yet horrifyingly human. Mark's stomach sank. He had heard that voice before, from calls on his radio during hospital transports. But he couldn't explain how it could appear here, in a building abandoned for decades. They continued cautiously down a hallway lined with rooms that had once held patients in critical care. Every door they passed creaked open and slammed shut on its own. Shadows darted just beyond their vision, disappearing whenever they turned their heads. Mark reached one particular room and froze. Inside, the floor was covered in what looked like hundreds of handprints, smudges and dust, arranged deliberately, as though someone or something had pressed them there over years of waiting. Inside the room, a hospital bed shifted slowly. Mark approached, heart pounding, and saw faint scratches along the walls, spelling out, "We never leave." A cold draft enveloped him, and a whisper echoed, "Join us." The team ran, one by one, stumbling over debris and each other, exiting the hospital into the cold night. Mark never returned and swore to never speak of what he saw. But the nightmares followed him for years. Meanwhile, across the country, a night nurse named Lucy worked in a pediatric ward of an old hospital. Lucy often stayed late to finish charts, the quiet halls providing focus. One night, she noticed the soft sound of a child laughing in a hallway. The ward had been empty for hours. When Lucy followed the sound, she saw a little girl standing in the doorway of a patient room, wearing an old-fashioned nightgown. The girl didn't speak. She only pointed toward the elevator. Curiosity and concern pulled Lucy forward. The elevator doors opened, revealing an empty shaft. But the girl stepped forward anyway, seemingly descending into nothingness. Lucy screamed and ran back to the nurse's station. Moments later, the girl reappeared in the doorway, watching silently, eyes hollow and unblinking. The laughter returned, echoing from every corner of the hallway. Lucy reported the incident, but no one believed her. Over the next weeks, other nurses reported the same apparition. Each encounter leaving them shaken and anxious. In another story, security guard Daniel worked the night shift in a rural hospital known for its historical hauntings. Daniel had walked these halls hundreds of times. But one night, the hospital felt wrong. The air was heavier, thick with an unseen presence. As he rounded the oncology wing, his flashlight flickered, revealing a figure at the end of the corridor. A nurse in a blood-stained uniform, staring at him with hollow eyes. Daniel called out, but the figure didn't move. Instead, it began slowly approaching, its footsteps silent. Heart racing, Daniel backed away, fumbling for his radio. The figure vanished as he hit the call button, leaving a cold residue in its place. Daniel tried to rationalize it, blaming sleep deprivation. But the next night, the same figure returned, this time standing by the doorway of the patient records room, staring silently. Some hauntings were not visual, but auditory. In an abandoned psychiatric hospital, researchers reported hearing an endless cacophony of screams, laughter, and whispers. The most unsettling sound, however, was a patient's recorded voice, repeated over and over. "I'm still here. I see you." One investigator described how his flashlight would cut out whenever the voice spoke directly to him, as if the building itself controlled the technology. Then there was the story of Nurse Caroline, who worked in a hospital with a history of poltergeist activity. One night, while checking on a terminal patient, she saw the oxygen monitor swing wildly, despite the patient's vitals remaining stable. The equipment beeped in rapid bursts, forming a pattern. Caroline, trained in medical monitoring, recognized it. Morse code. The message was simple, yet horrifying. Leave before it takes you. Caroline froze as the room temperature dropped drastically. Her breath became visible in the frigid air, and the shadow of a nurse from decades past appeared at the foot of the bed, hands reaching toward her. She stumbled backward, nearly falling over the IV stand, and escaped the room trembling. The patient passed away peacefully an hour later, leaving Caroline with an unshakable feeling that the presence had been waiting for the living to leave, yet never truly departed. Hospitals are full of reminders of mortality. Machines beep for vital signs. Hallways echo with footsteps, and the smell of antiseptic mixes with lingering sorrow. In haunted hospitals, these elements become instruments of terror. In one Midwestern facility, patients reported seeing figures walking down halls that no longer existed. Doors appeared in walls when no door frame was installed. Televisions flickered with static images of former patients, sometimes moving, sometimes screaming. In an old wing of a coastal hospital, Janice, a night janitor, experienced phenomena she could not explain. Mopping the floors late at night, she would see shadows moving against the walls, accompanied by the faint sound of dragging chains. The chains seemed to follow her, their metallic clinking growing louder as she moved. One night, the shadows formed a figure of a man, face obscured, and it spoke. "You cannot leave." Janice ran, leaving her mop and bucket behind, never returning after dark. Even hospital kitchens were not immune. Chef Miguel worked late shifts in a historic hospital where he noticed the smell of rotting food when no meals were being prepared. Utensils would fall from shelves, pots would rattle, and phantom footsteps would echo through the empty kitchen. Miguel once saw a full dining tray levitate mid-air, spinning slowly before crashing to the floor, scattering silverware. The hospital staff never believed him, attributing it to stress and imagination. Yet Miguel knew otherwise. In some cases, the most terrifying hauntings were the ones that mimicked human behavior. A doctor named Liam encountered a patient who claimed to have visited the hospital years before, though records showed he had never been admitted. The patient would speak in exact phrases doctors and nurses used, sometimes completing conversations before the staff could finish. Shadows would move behind him, and cold drafts would swirl around the room when he was present. Liam left the room, unsettled, unable to shake the feeling that something had crossed over from the past to observe the present. Some hauntings were cyclical, repeating events that had occurred decades earlier. In a psychiatric hospital An old operating theater showed the same sequence of events nightly. Footsteps approaching, surgical tools clattering, and a surgeon's voice calling out instructions to unseen assistants. The theater was locked, yet staff who dared to peek through the windows reported seeing figures performing procedures on invisible patients. The cold air carrying whispers of pain and suffering. What ties these stories together is a pattern. Hospitals are repositories of trauma. They store not only physical suffering, but emotional and spiritual echoes. Staff and patients alike often experience residual hauntings. The replay of past events, shadows of the dead, and disembodied voices calling out for recognition or release. Some encounters are fleeting, leaving only a sense of unease. Others are direct, interactive, and terrifying, challenging the very boundaries of what we consider reality. In every story, there is a sense of inevitability. The hospitals themselves seem to act as guardians of these echoes, refusing to let them fade. People entering these spaces at night, volunteers, staff, or curious explorers, often encounter a world where time bends, where the living intersect with the dead, and where every shadow, every sound, and every chill carries the weight of countless lost lives. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't immediately understand. Hannah's heart raced, but curiosity pushed her forward. She traced the sounds to the hallway outside the old surgical theater. The doors were closed, yet a light flickered inside. Hannah entered cautiously, noticing surgical instruments laid out neatly on the tray. Though no staff had been present in months, the instruments trembled slightly, as if being handled by invisible hands. A cold draft swept across the room, extinguishing her flashlight. She fumbled, dropping it, and when it rolled across the floor, the beam illuminated a figure in the corner. A surgeon, wearing a blood-stained apron, face hidden. Hannah froze. The figure slowly turned, revealing hollow, dark eyes, then vanished. She bolted from the room, the whispering now following her down the corridor, repeating the words, "We are still here." When she returned the next day, the surgical theater had been empty, spotless, with instruments neatly stored as if nothing had happened. She tried to tell colleagues, but they dismissed it as fatigue or imagination. Yet, each night she worked in that wing, she felt eyes on her, cold hands brushing past her, and whispers echoing down empty halls. Across town, a maintenance worker named Carlos shared a terrifying encounter in a pediatric oncology wing. He was tasked with replacing a water heater, working after hours when the hallways were deserted. As he climbed a ladder, he heard giggling and soft singing. Looking around, he saw nothing. Yet, small handprints appeared on the wall, glowing faintly under his flashlight. The singing became louder, almost childlike but distorted, echoing unnaturally through the empty corridor. Carlos froze, feeling an icy hand press on his shoulder. Whipping around, no one was there. The handprints on the wall began moving, sliding upward and then disappearing. He ran, leaving his tools behind, and never returned to that wing after dark. In another story, a night shift doctor, Ethan, experienced an encounter in the hospital's morgue. He had been working late, documenting autopsy reports, when he noticed the room's temperature dropping sharply. Frost formed on the metal tables, despite the heating system functioning normally. A drawer containing bodies creaked open by itself. Ethan approached cautiously, and a voice, low and almost melodic, whispered, "Don't forget us." Turning quickly, he saw no one. Yet the drawers continued to rattle, as though the dead were trying to communicate. Ethan left immediately, and after that night, he requested transfers to day shifts only. Some hauntings are tied to past tragedies. In one urban hospital, a massive fire had claimed dozens of lives decades ago. Staff working the night shift reported hearing the faint smell of smoke and screams coming from an empty wing. Doors would slam without cause, and the smell of burning flesh lingered in the air. One night, a nurse named Lisa was alone on the floor when she saw shadowy figures running toward her, then disappearing just before impact. She ran screaming, convinced that the spirits of those who died in the fire were reliving their last moments, trapped between life and death, seeking acknowledgement. The pattern of hauntings in hospitals often involves repetition. People witness events as if the past is replaying, gurneys moving on their own, patients appearing in hallways where no one is admitted, and doctors performing unseen surgeries. In one psychiatric hospital, a patient repeatedly reported seeing a woman in a long black gown standing at the foot of his bed. She would whisper his name and vanish before anyone could reach him. Staff ignored him initially, but when multiple patients reported the same figure, they began to investigate. Cameras placed in the rooms captured unexplained shadows and movements. Though no figure was ever fully visible, in another chilling incident, a cleaning staff member named Ruth worked the night shift in a hospital known for paranormal activity. While cleaning an old ward, she saw a nurse mannequin she hadn't noticed before, standing in the corner. When Ruth approached, the mannequin turned slowly to face her, eyes empty, and whispered her name. She screamed and ran from the ward, never returning alone. Staff later found the mannequin placed neatly back in the corner, as if mocking her fear. Technology often behaves strangely in haunted hospitals. Security cameras malfunction, lights flicker, and alarms trigger with no cause. A tech support specialist, Jeremy, was called to investigate repeated false alarms in a storage room. When he arrived, all cameras displayed static, but a faint outline of a patient walking down the hallway appeared on one monitor. Jeremy approached the room, and the monitor showed him standing there, though he hadn't yet arrived. Moments later, the figure turned toward him, mouth moving as though calling out. When he opened the door, the hallway was empty. In yet another story, a nurse named Faith worked in a hospital where a mysterious patient room remained perpetually occupied despite no records of admission. Each night, she would hear faint coughing and whispers behind the closed door. Attempts to open it revealed an empty room. On one occasion, she left a flashlight on the floor outside the room. When she returned, it was in the center of the bed, beam shining directly at the empty corner. The whispers repeated her name, growing louder, more insistent, echoing down the halls. Some experiences are tactile rather than visual or auditory. Maintenance workers report tools moving on their own. Janitors feel cold hands on their shoulders, and doctors feel sudden pressure, as if someone is leaning over them during night shifts. In one hospital, a young resident named Miguel described lying awake in the staff lounge, feeling invisible fingers tracing his arm. When he turned to see who it was, no one was there. Yet he felt an overwhelming presence, a reminder that the hospital itself remembered every life that passed through it. In a rural hospital, the most persistent hauntings involved apparitions of former patients and staff, repeating the same actions they performed decades ago. Security guards report walking past empty wards and seeing nurses tending to invisible patients. Doctors witness shadows moving across hallways, and patients describe seeing long-deceased relatives in waiting rooms. The hospital becomes a stage where time folds in on itself, and the living are forced to witness echoes of the past. The final story brings together several strands. A group of paranormal investigators ventured into a massive abandoned hospital. Using thermal cameras, EVP recorders, and motion sensors, they documented hundreds of anomalous events: cold spots, voices, shadows, and inexplicable movements. One investigator, reviewing footage later, noticed a figure appearing only on infrared standing in the hallway, holding a tray of surgical instruments, watching silently. Despite multiple attempts to communicate, the figure never moved or reacted, only observing. Many conclude that hospitals, with their intense human emotion, trauma, and mortality, act as amplifiers for paranormal activity. Pain, grief, and fear imprint themselves on the environment, creating echoes that can interact with the living. Witnesses consistently report the same patterns: unexplained sounds, moving shadows, apparitions, and the feeling of being watched. Even the bravest professionals, trained to deal with life and death, are not immune to the terror of haunted hospitals. These stories serve as a reminder that the world may hold more than the eye can see. The corridors, rooms, and wards of hospitals are repositories of memory, some of it so intense that it refuses to fade. Those who enter these spaces at night risk encountering the echoes of the past, ghosts that do not rest, and entities whose suffering extends beyond life. Whether it's a flicker of movement, a whisper, or a shadow crossing a hallway, haunted hospitals continue to terrify those who dare to explore them. They are places where life and death intersect, where the human soul leaves behind traces too potent to ignore, and where curiosity can lead to encounters that haunt a lifetime.